12 p.m., so let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Maya Tarashvili. I'm the director of FPRI's Eurasia program, and I have the honor of hosting today's discussion. We'll be talking about Russia sanctions and their impact on South Korea, but not only. This is a part of our ongoing research project about Russia sanctions and their impact on South Korea. A very long report forthcoming next week, so please keep an eye on our website at fpri.org. I would like to thank the Korea Foundation for making this research possible. And I would also like to thank Max Hess, who is one of our speakers today, but for leading this project and for authoring this forthcoming report about Russia sanctions and their impact on various parts of the world with emphasis on South Korea. Today, I'm joined by Max Hess, who is our Central Asia Fellow at the Eurasia Program at Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's based in London, and he's the founder of the London-based political risk firm and Metena Advisory. We're also joined by Alan Maggard, who serves as an analyst with C4ADS's conflict-affected state cell, where he specializes in investigating illicit tech procurement networks tied to the Russian defense industry. So I think this is going to be a really fascinating conversation. We'll start with Max, then turn it over to Alan, exchange a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. So as questions come up, please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. We will get to as many of them as we can. We have an hour for this conversation. This discussion is also being recorded, and it will become available on FPRI's website and on our YouTube page later today. So again, really the best space to watch is going to be fpri.org for follow-on work, but also for further information about our guests, their bios, and their additional work on these issues. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Max. Thank you so much for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about what's in your forthcoming report and the Russia sanctions.
Perfect. Well, I'll start off with why South Korea and our particular interest in understanding and analyzing South Korea's position. South Korea is, of course, a close and long-standing Western ally, a core democratic state in East Asia that is intimately involved with U.S. geopolitics, both for its relations to China, but also, of course, North Korea, just to its north. Russia has often played an important factor in those relationships as well, but particularly had a very interesting position with regards to South Korea and South Korean relations over the last decade, which we've seen shift quite tremendously. And the sanctions on Russia have really played a large role in that. South Korea is certainly not a country immune from experience with sanctions policy, both in how the U.S. administers it, but also how South Korea reacts to it, and how it shapes it, and how it plays out in South Korean domestic politics. But primarily that has been historically a question about North Korea, and then in the future for South Korea, whose major trading partner other than the United States is also the People's Republic of China, been a real important question about how increasing trade tensions between the United States and China could play out on the Korean Peninsula. But with regards to Russia sanctions in particular, South Korea was one of three key countries that had not been part of the Western-led sanctions regime against Russia in 2014, but then joined it more or less in its entirety. And of course, we'll talk quite a bit later about where more and where less after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And to set out for any listeners who may be less familiar with the history of sanctions policy on Russia, we have plenty of publications that cover that, but I think for the purposes of this conversation and for understanding South Korea and the lessons to learn from it in particular, it's important to note that sanctions after 2014 were initially really used as a tool to try to disincentivize Russia from waging further war against Ukraine and to alter its policies, as well as to potentially be serious about enforcing the so-called Minsk agreements of late 2014 and 2015 that were meant to end the conflict that Russia had fomented in eastern Ukraine. But from 2022 onwards, sanctions have really been about restricting Russia's state capacity, its ability to wage this war. I don't think there's much hope left in anywhere in the West that sanctions in and of themselves can actually change Russian policy, but they certainly can and have imposed real costs on Russia, from the oil price cap that was begun last year to, of course, the Russian central bank and the key and largest sanctions that came in February of 2022, just 3 days after the full-scale Russian invasion, that aimed to cut Russia off from global financial systems, aimed to make it very difficult for Russia to import a large number of goods, which were supplemented with sanctions and trade controls, as well as to directly impact the Russian focus of the war. And so as we get to the later parts of our conversation, we'll talk quite a bit more about where sanctions are really impacting the war. But to bring it back to South Korea and its position, as I said, it was one of 3 countries that have since 2022 joined the sanctions regime by and large, but were not members of it in 2014, although some had some restrictions, in particular, the other 2 being Singapore and Switzerland, the 3 S countries. Switzerland had some Russian sanctions through its relationships with the European Union and treaty agreements, but only fully joined them after last February. And Singapore was not a sanctions-inducing country, just like South Korea wasn't. But of course, South Korea's position is particularly unique amongst those as the country that arguably has the closest relations, not only with the West more broadly, does not have the neutrality theme of its politics that is such a key role in these issues in Switzerland, but is very clearly a Western ally and of course has very close defense ties to the United States. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to walk through the political environment in South Korea in 2014, try to explain a little bit of why it wasn't a sanctions imposing country, and then moving on to 2022, the introduction of sanctions and some of the impacts that we saw there. So to begin in 2014, and really just before, the president of Korea at the time, center-right-leaning President Park, had spent her presidency to that point aiming to really strengthen relations with Russia. This is, before the annexation of Crimea, even going back to 2013, when the Kremlin's rhetoric of Eurasianism, and in particular this idea that Putin had raised that, well, Europe shouldn't just range from the European Union, but we aim for a structure that goes all the way from Lisbon in Portugal to Vladivostok in Russia's far east, northeast of South Korea, is something that really had shaped South Korean politics. And then, of course, there was the overriding issue of North Korea and the potential for Russia to increase support. And it was only in 2013 and in 2012 that Russia actually last voted at the UN Security Council level for sanctions on North Korea. So this was a balance that the Korean government at the time, the Park administration, was not keen to upset. In one of the sort of remarkable findings that we had in this report was, despite speaking to a number of people on both sides, was that both on the US side in particular, there was an understanding that this wasn't seen as a major issue. And in the South Korean side, we had discussions that indicated there actually had not been a lot of pressure for South Korea to join the initial sanctions regime in 2014, despite the fact that obviously, because of the overlying issue of North Korea, it likely would have been pretty possible to exert that kind of influence. And Japan, which has its own complicated geopolitical relationship with South Korea, as Western allies, but with particular historical disputes over Japan's position in World War II in particular, which do occasionally lead to trade spats as well, and who compete both for their exports and their engineering in a lot of the same markets. Japan was a sanctions imposing member, but really through the G7 auspices and not to the same extent of sanctions, particularly on the Russian hydrocarbons and banking industry that we saw in the West after 2014. So that also meant there was less pressure in that environment more generally. South Korean businesses had been expanding to Russia across a number of sectors, but we'll talk a little bit about later about automotive and engineering, which became even more important. And then also finally that South Korea at that time was soon to enter a presidential election, which occurred in 2015. Which was due to occur in 2017, but then, of course, entered its own massive political scandal around the Park administration, who was caught up in a series of corruption scandals in 2015, 2016 that really dominated South Korean politics. That then led to a very large shift in approach with the election in 2017 of President Moon, South Korea's most left-wing president, arguably in its history, and who had really come to power not only campaigning against the alleged corruption of the previous administration, but also on a new approach with North Korea and aiming to lower tensions there and remove trade restrictions. The Moon administration also saw Russia as a key player in a lot of these factors and supported the expansion of South Korean trade and South Korean business from that time onwards, despite the overlying Western sanctions. And this is where some South Korean businesses we then found really became key suppliers to Russia that was cut off either for financial reasons or for direct sanctions reasons from the West, including in engineering, where Samsung Engineering, amongst others, took up projects for companies like Gazprom Neft that were subject to sectoral sanctions in the United States, but also crucially for shipbuilding, where a large number of South Korean shipbuilders began winning the majority of international contracts handed out by Russia, including for its development of offshore facilities and Arctic facilities, whose development had also been targeted by the sectoral sanctions. The shift, however, began under that administration after the full-scale Russian invasion in February of 2022, which was swiftly followed by South Korea's elections that March that brought the current President Yoon administration of the People's Power Party, a reconstituting of the traditional center-right that had splintered after President Park's impeachment scandal 5 years earlier, to power, with the Yoon administration taking a much more pro-Western role and really coming in large part due to its not only feeling that it needed to move closer to the United States in an environment of increased tensions in China and renewed tensions in North Korea, but also in line with the horrors that were witnessed in the initial days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. South Korea subsequently became a member of almost all of the international sanctions against Russia, including SWIFT sanctions, trade and export controls, but has continue to face a number of real key issues in implementing these and faces a lot of questions about its political environment over the coming years. In that these South Korean businesses who had really expanded their trade in Russia from 2014 onwards have been significantly impacted with a number of contracts canceled across the shipping industry, which had broadly faced challenges due to low prices for ships in previous years anyway, leaving a number of vessels without ultimate final buyers, but then also in compliance concerns around a number of South Korean companies who have continued to trade with Russia. We find that across a number of sectors, from even South Korean manufacturers who have pulled out of the country, have in some cases exploited Russia's so-called parallel import structure to continue to get vehicles and other technological goods into Russia. But we also found that one of the key impacts over the medium term is going to be that because of the capital controls in Russia and affecting its banks, as well as the increased trade with China, that a lot of South Korean products, at least on the consumer market, have themselves become far less competitive in Russia, in particular compared to Chinese products, and are likely to continue to do so. So I think we'll get a chance to talk a little bit later about where things are going and the outlook. But what I want to say is to bring it back to that aim of sanctions at the end is now sanctions play a key role, not only in putting costs on Russia for launching this war in Ukraine and its other aggressive foreign policy actions, both there and on the international sphere, and continued threat that it poses, but also are really important for constraining the Russian war machine and its ability to attack Ukraine, to cause loss to Ukrainian lives, and give the Kremlin advantages in that ongoing conflict, which sadly I believe it shows no signs of changing its policy on, and therefore serve as a key tool not only for the West itself, but also for Ukraine. And this is where South Korea, we probably have the most questions and is worthy of the most focus. And we're very glad to have Alan Maggart of C4ADS here, who's looked into a number of these issues with Korean goods that have made it into Russia, in some cases may continue to make it into Russia. And so I'll turn over to him for his part of the presentation, and then hopefully we can get a chance to talk later about some of the areas that potentially there could be improvements of both compliance, enforcement, and international coordination. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Yes, my name is Alan Maggart. I'm a Russia analyst at the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. Just kind of some background. For the past year and a few months, I've been focusing pretty much all of my research and analysis, investigations, whatever you want to call it, on Russian defense industry procurement of foreign manufactured computer numeric control machine tools. It's kind of a word salad, but these are technologies that are used to manufacture components. It can be for military applications or for civilian applications. It's kind of a quintessential dual-use technology. Technology itself is pretty simple. You have a cutting tool that will remove material from a metal object to produce a final product. And over the course of my research, I identified this trend that initially perplexed me, which was after February 24th, 2022, you saw a lot of imports of foreign machine tools in Russia from Europe decline. And those have been declining for many years, going back to 2014. And it was never really totally eliminated, that trade. But around October 2022, there was a big spike in trade between South Korea and Russia, trade in CNC machine tools. And that trend perplexed me. You know, you think about Seoul, South Korea, it's a US ally in the Asia Pacific. It seems very strange initially that there would continue to be this trade in a dual-use technology from South Korea to Russia. But I think Max's report does a very good job spelling out the domestic and diplomatic factors that went into the, I don't want to say delay, but the timeline with which the South Koreans implemented export controls and sanctions against Russia. Going back to machine tools, however, there's a very rich history if you go through Russian official public procurement records of Russian defense enterprises seeking to purchase and ultimately obtaining these foreign produced machine tools, which I should add, they're not manually operated. These are operated by computer programs that make them super precise and very advantageous for manufacturing components for very complex weapon systems, such as missiles, drones, and in one instance, I actually found an example of a CNC machine tool made by Samsung being used to manufacture a breech loader for a tank gun known as the 2A46M. And this is there's a video I found from August 30th, 2017 that shows this machine in action. If you'd be so kind as to pull it up.
Sorry, just one moment.
Sure.
All right, here we go.
И техническое перевооружение. Оснащение производства новым, высокопроизводительным, заготовительным, сборочно-сварочным и обрабатывающим оборудованием. С применением современного оборудования пересматриваются и изменяются технологии обработки основных деталей, в том числе и ствольной трубы. При этом появляется возможность создания новых, перспективных образцов вооружений, которым предъявляются гораздо более жесткие требования по точности изготовления.
Yes. Thank you for pointing
I'll
that out.
go to the PDF as well while I'm screen sharing.
So the object being machined in that video, the metallic block with all the holes in it, it took a little bit of doing, but over the course of my investigation, I identified it as this breech loader, which is used in tanks ranging from the T-64 to the T-90. The video that Maya just so graciously showed is one of it's kind of a rare example showing a foreign produced machine tool in use actually making an identifiable weapons component. But we suspect that this is very representative of what the Russian defense industry is using these tools for. They're not using them to manufacture, refrigerators or anything like that. They're being used to create components for larger weapon systems. And these machine tools that they're procuring from abroad and have procured from abroad for many years, from South Korea as well as from other countries, are advantageous over Russian produced machine tools, in that there are really no comparable Russian machine tools that are capable of taking computerized inputs and outputting finalized products with the same level of precision, accuracy, and speed as do foreign produced machine tools. In the broad scheme of things, South Korean machine tools they haven't been the most in demand compared to other countries. When you look at like the Rolls-Royce, if you want to make the Rolls-Royce analogy, the most advanced machine tools out there are from European Union, Japan. However, South Korea's products are still clearly very in demand from segments of the Russian defense industry. The background you see behind me is from a news broadcast hosted by Alexander Rogatkin. He's a television personality with Rossiya 24. And back in late July of this year, he did a walkthrough of a former shopping mall turned drone production plant in Izhevsk, Russia. And in the background here, you can see the logos are sort of blurred out, but if you dig deep enough, you can actually, these are pretty distinct looking products. The two blue machines in the back are manufactured by a company called Dian Solutions, formerly Doosan Machine Tools. The white and black one on the right is manufactured by Hyundai W1A. And when this video came out, there was actually a few people on the internet who were able to identify these as South Korean machine tools. And these are actually, this plant that these are located in is responsible for manufacturing the Lancet barrage drone, which Russia has used to kind of dreadful effect, I guess is the only word for it, in Ukraine against Ukrainian military targets. So by way of these examples, clearly there's something that I won't say went wrong, but over the past decade, these machines have made their way to Russia. They have been used in the defense industry. It's an open question as to, the extent to which, an individual machine tool is responsible for, battlefield advantage. But on the basis of these examples that we've shown and that we've found over time, it is pretty clear that the policy of open trade that South Korea has had with Russia over the past decade has, in certain instances, provided material to the Russian defense industry, which has then gone on to support the war effort in Ukraine.
Thank you so much. I have quite a few questions, but I just want to remind our audience members that they can send in their questions using the Q&A feature, and I will get to as many of them as I possibly can. Max, I have a bigger picture question for you, but while we are still with Alan and talking about this, I just want to ask you on to maybe zoom out just slightly. So under the sanctions regime, obviously, sort of import substitution is a major priority for Russia to keep on sort of feeding its war machine, to be able to create a lot of these weapons systems in-house or at home, if you will. And I think an example that you just offered us speaks a lot to that. It seems like not only are they prioritizing domestic production, but they're also getting very creative about it and somewhat deceitful also to trade partners. But I recently read an article from Dmitry Gorenberg, for example, who says that this import substitution strategy, it is a priority, but it seems to be more of a long-term outlook thing, meaning it's not going to help feed the war machine in the next year or even two. What's your outlook based on what you're looking at? Do you think that Russia will be able to make significant advances in this regard in time to gain advantage over Ukraine in the war? Or does this look to you more still like an R&D type of situation where they're still trying to be creative and testing out the possibilities?
It's a good question. With regards to manufacturing and machine tools in particular, there's been a lot of PR, a lot of press over the past year about advances made in domestic machine tool building. The problem with a lot of these announced advances is that the machine tool industry in Russia already is reportedly several years behind on deliveries, and the domestic machine tool industry, as it stands right now, can't meet all the demand that's being placed on it by, in particular, the Russian defense industry, but also other civilian industries. And listen, I don't doubt that on a long enough timeline that domestic industrial capacity for building machine tools will improve. But you have to take into account, like, what are the machines that are building these machine tools, which already have to be very precise and demand a level of precision and accuracy and control that is not available from domestically produced machine tools. It has to come from foreign analogs. So I'm talking specifically about Russian machine tool building, to say nothing of the defense industry. I think going forward, the defense industry is going to continue to rely on these foreign machine tools in terms of expanding productive capacity. And its ability to expand that productive capacity is constrained by the availability of trained specialists, people who know how to operate computer numeric control machine tools. It'll also be constrained by the availability of people who know how to train other people on those tools. So if you're in a situation where you can't get the kind of product that you've imported over the years, and for which there's a pre-existing cadre of specialists who know how to use those systems, then you might have a little bit of trouble. But the real question going forward in terms of Russia's ability simply to just sustain the military operation and special military operation, scare quotes, and its ability to sustain production in service of that war effort, the question boils down to what sort of consumables that are used in machine tool operation, what's happening with that supply chain. You can't just use a machine tool for several years with the parts that you have. These things break down. Cutting machines with cutting tools get worn down, electrical motors, and these are very complex electromechanical machines. They have a lot of moving parts, and those break down, and all those parts come from abroad as well. So there's really two questions here. What is going to be done about restricting parallel import of new machine tool equipment that can serve to expand military production, and what's being done to restrict parallel imports of the consumables, things like cutting tools, cutting liquid, drive belts, electrical servo motors. What's being done to restrict imports of those goods that are going to enable the existing machine tool park assets in place in Russian defense industry entities? What's going to be done to keep those imports from sustaining those existing machines over time? Those are the two main questions that are the key ones in this particular area as I see it.
And I think that's such a great question to use as a jumping off point to turn over to Max, this question about parallel imports. So there are layers here. This is really, really complex because we're not just looking at enforcing the sanctions, but we're also looking at just getting countries to participate in a sanctions regime. So whether that's, sort of enforcement, compliance, then coordination with other countries. We see how heavily Russia relies on some of these third countries for parallel imports. So not just South Korea initially, but Turkey, even tiny Georgia. I just keep grappling with this idea of, Max, like what can the international community do to get more countries to join in the sanctions regime? So before we even get to the idea of compliance or just enforcement, not compliance, just to get other countries to join. And I think South Korea is a very good example of this, and maybe the South Korean example can be helpful in understanding what has changed from 2014 to 2022, right? Not joining the regime initially, then joining it later on. Are there any applicable lessons, right, that the West could use for countries that are not participating in the sanctions regime?
Sure. I'll answer it sort of in two parts, or maybe even three, but begin with, the big change in South Korea that we saw from 2014 until 2022 was a very large shift in the domestic political environment, but one in which Russia was not really a primary factor, but Russian politics changed, the approach to Russia changed due to the approach of domestic Korean political actors, in particular the respective holders of the presidency at the time. We did see a big shift in the sort of philosophical approach, at least although the parties were reconstituted given this large impeachment scandal in 2017 that I mentioned earlier of President Park. The center-right's approach very much shifted from a business-heavy approach to one that was really dominated by geopolitical concerns. South Korea was in some ways arguably the lowest hanging fruit of the countries that hadn't joined the West sanctions regime because of its close ties to the West. I think really in particular the fact that South Korea wasn't a part of the sanctions regime from 2014 onwards, and that there was apparently so little pressure in the United States to do so, is a warning for Western policymakers in particular about where they should prioritize these matters, and that could have real impacts in the future, because it has to be handled as a priority. Because one of the questions about these things then going forward is South Korean business still remains very influential, and a lot of the so-called chaebols, the large Korean companies like Hyundai, like Samsung, have what we in the West view as non-traditional corporate structures, with many interlocking companies holding shares in one another, but not sort of one ultimate parent company, then holding all of the shares in its, or most of the shares in the majority of its subsidiaries. but also the fact that in the South Korean political environment, a lot of the questions and a lot of the criticism we see on the South Korean left in particular also takes a forward-looking view towards China and how pressure from the US to join sanctions may affect Seoul's relationship with Beijing. And especially given the current rhetoric of so-called decoupling, which is probably outside of the scope of this conversation here for how effective that is between the West and China, and that will always be a far larger and far higher priority question than Russia. So I think the real big takeaway from South Korea in particular for getting other countries to join the sanctions regimes is an understanding that Russia's sanctions and the issue may not necessarily be at the forefront of their domestic politics, but it is really an effort that falls to U.S. diplomacy to frame it in light of those, and how both non-compliance and evasion can increase their own geopolitical risks, even if not directly related to the Russia conflict, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to be precise. On parallel imports and the like, we did identify a number of South Korean companies who, in contrast to the claims that you hear from a lot of, say, European businesses that, oh, well, we were just selling and just so happened that someone imported X or Y via Turkey or Kyrgyzstan. Of course, there was, the famous white goods reporting over the last year. But a lot of the South Korean high technology, in particular, both in the CNC field that Alan so masterfully discusses, but also in the high-tech electronics goods, are ones that are harder for that kind of, say, excuse, I think, to happen, but where we need to be vigilant because of what we've seen with regards to other South Korean companies effectively, knowingly exploiting some of those parallel routes, including in Kazakhstan, to effectively move operations out of Russia, move finalizing plants for, in one case, Hyundai vehicles to Kazakhstan to then be sold almost certainly over the border into Russia. But the one final point, and I'll make also, is on the export controls and the like. South Korea did have delays in joining those restrictions, has subsequently, through the good work of Alan and others, as awareness of this issue has been raised, and as we continue to help supporting, I do see some improvements on at least the political discussion around it in South Korea. But I think, in particular, with a lot of these technological goods, there's a real need for separate structures of international cooperation around them, whether that be a specific fora of export controls experts and officials from various administrations, because the majority of people who are setting these policies and who are doing are not themselves technical experts. And what kind of machine lathe or CNC tool, or in the case of chips in particular, may be substitutable for another, or fungible with it, or used to find a way to fill the same production loophole that exists, is something that I think just there is no one voice that has the answer on that. And so for me, with regards to South Korea at this present point, it's less a question of willingness. That is something we need to keep in mind as the debate around China and South Korea's own political cycle continues, but I think really is far more about improving international cooperation on a lot of these direct trade as well, and from that, improvements on so-called parallel imports into Russia and third countries will flow and follow, and increase the incentives for others to join those kind of programs. But I think we can't just say South Korean compliance hasn't been all that we'd hoped it to be. We have to say, this is why we think it is, and these issues are complex, and we need to work together to ensure that it is more in line with what I currently think Seoul, DC, Ukraine, and Europe writ broad are on board with.
Thank you, Max. Alan, I want to turn this over to you really quickly. This question about not just countries joining the sanctions, but the sort of the regulations, the enforcement, the research that you do is very valuable in that regard. What is your outlook? Do you see, this is not a foolproof system, right? But it's very important for this to be enforced. What's your outlook based on the work that you've done? Do you think that it's possible to make the system as foolproof as possible within reason?
Gina Raimondo, Commerce Secretary, U.S. Commerce Secretary, gave a speech yesterday at the, I think it was the Reagan, God, I had to check my notes for the full name of it. It's kind of Reagan National Defense Foundation. It's kind of a word salad. But Secretary Raimondo, during this speech, she made a number of comments, basically trying to emphasize the need to strengthen the Bureau of Industry of Security, which is, for those who don't know, is the U.S. agency responsible for enforcing export control regulations. BIS is the, to reuse the same metaphor or whatever, the Rolls Royce of international export control agencies, but it's not, operating as effectively as it might by Raimondo's own admission. She noted that BIS is operating with the same budget it had a decade ago, $200 million. And that is not enough to achieve the sort of export control objectives that are now confronting the same kind of challenges, I should say, that are confronting the United States. The situation in other countries is not necessarily much better. If BIS, which is the leader in terms of export control enforcement globally, is as constrained as it is, imagine the situation in other countries, whether it's South Korea or Taiwan, you name it. I am optimistic that with additional funding and with better coordination among allied countries, that export controls can be made more effective, and for there to be less instances of things slipping through the cracks. However, that's going to take a lot of political will. I think as it stands right now, a country like South Korea, it's probably doing its best with input from the United States, but as the U.S., assuming that we get a more robust BIS in the future that's able to conduct the sort of really data intensive investigations that are necessary in order to detect and in some instances maybe even preempt export control violations. In order to coordinate with partner countries, there needs to be a balancing act. We don't want to necessarily be in a position, Washington doesn't want to be in a position where it's becoming overbearing vis-a-vis its foreign partners. I was speaking to someone recently who has a good deal of knowledge about the export control system and USG's coordination with other countries on export controls, and she mentioned that a lot of these countries, going back to the 1980s when there's a whole different set of export control arrangements, there's always been I wouldn't say a disconnect, but there's always a gap to be overcome between what USG wants to achieve in terms of coordinating export controls and what our partner countries, what they're able to do and what's advantageous for them. And she phrased it as, a country like South Korea views its ability to conduct trade freely. It's nothing, ideological about, free trade does this, does that. It's an existential necessity. To the extent that Seoul is able to trade with whomever it wants and enmeshes itself in the international commercial system, I don't know if it needs a definitive article of that, the more that it's able to enmesh itself in global trade, the more unlikely it is in their estimation that they'll be attacked by North Korea, because it would constitute it would disrupt global trade massively. So their ability to conduct trade freely, they view that as a strategic asset, and any kind of conversation that the United States has with South Korea regarding strengthening export controls, plugging leaks, gaps in enforcement. That's going to be a conversation that needs to be had, and it's going to happen on an ongoing basis. So yeah, that's my view on that.
Thank you, Alan. I want to encourage our audience members to send in their questions using the Q&A feature. We do have a few. I'm not sure I quite understand this one, but Max, maybe you might have a comment on this. Can investors in companies trading in spare parts for computer-controlled machining units exert pressure on management? So I think this is more about how sort of large companies relate to their investors, right? So I don't know if you
Sure.
on the...
I mean, I would say in general, yes, investors have a lot of ability to exert pressure for the companies that are listed in these sectors. Anybody who's found to be doing, obviously, the simplest way that investors exert pressure is by selling shares. I think a lot of it is about awareness, though, right? Companies don't detail, even in their annual reports, their quarterly reports, necessarily exactly who they're selling to and where they're selling to. They report gross sales figures, and I don't think it's the duty of shareholders necessarily to scrutinize their own companies to that extent. What I mean to say is, I don't think as policymakers can leave that to the average investor, right? If fines and violations follow, then yes, there will be sell-offs. In some cases, I think the U.S. government has been hesitant to name and shame some companies. There's been a lot of lobbying, and we've seen not only from markets like South Korea, but European countries historically, that when they did things that violated at least the spirit of sanctions, that they sort of wouldn't be held to account. Germany was infamous for this after 2014. One of Germany's largest conglomerates, in particular Siemens, had a whole scandal with it, ended up having to spin off a power unit that had a joint venture with Russia, but was never fined or had any kind of direct governmental action, whether on a European level or a U.S. government level, taken against it, so that the ultimate impact of that on its share prices overall wasn't that large. So if one is an investor in a company that is named as doing something bad, then certainly I welcome that individual exerting as much pressure as possible. But I don't think from a policy standpoint it's sufficient to say that the market/investors will provide the solution to these challenges.
Thank you so much. I actually have somewhat of an opposite question, opposite to that, which is, how long do you think the resolve, sort of the sanctions regime, can hold out realistically? How long do you think there will still be, sort of the will for the international community to keep on imposing the sanctions? I mean, the reason, I'll go back to saying the reason why we even care about these sanctions is because Russia is waging a full-scale war in Ukraine. We're going on 2 years now, and it doesn't look like there is an end in sight to this war. So how do you see the will of the international community to keep on punishing Russia?
I mean, on the international community question, so much of it falls to the U.S. political environment in the United States next year. Of course, there are European parliamentary elections next year as well. I think there is a deeper base of support across a lot of European capitals, and in particular, the level of prioritization of the Ukraine conflict is one that is very high, even amongst those who have advocated a different economic approach, who are overall a far smaller part of the voice today than they were pre-February 2022. In the US, of course, we're very likely to face a very stark political question next year about the continued process with regard to the election that the US is having in November. Although, of course, even before then, we have key questions and deadlines to get over. I expect that there will be congressional support passed this month for Ukraine, as the Biden administration today has said is necessary. But that's not the last time that there will be a fight over that. And those issues will become even more politicized in the run-up to the election, where the polarization over the issue could decrease the chance of progress, especially if former President Trump does campaign actively on that issue. I think one point is he hasn't really been raising the issue as much lately, that he's hostile to this approach, but I certainly don't want to say that I can predict what he's going to do. But to the lessons from that for a country like South Korea, right, are I do think the South Korean political environment, absent US pressure, would be far less likely to continue to implement and enforce sanctions, even to the level that we've seen it so far. That doesn't mean there will be a complete going back to the 2014 approach, where South Korea remained outside the sanctions environment. South Korean businesses actively did, and in some cases were even encouraged to take advantage of the so-called business opportunity that Russia presented itself. But because it is not as high priority an issue in South Korea because of the domestic political environment, where there is a strong base amongst their Democratic Party, which is also the center-left party in South Korea as well, combined with the business pressures, means that I wouldn't expect Seoul, absent Western, in particular US pressure, to remain a major sanctions enforcing and implementing country.
I have another question from the audience. It says, if these are the Russian internal problems, do you think that they're able to carry on a larger operation in Eastern Europe? How threatened is Putin's position in a situation where they are unable to finish not even the domestic issues? Alan, I know you had a chance to answer this in writing. I don't know if you want to answer this question out loud for the rest of the audience, and then
I have one question that I'd kind of like to tack on to that for Alan, maybe, which is just one last point on the CNC tools in particular, and which you touched on about them needing spare parts and the like. How much is this a question of dealing with a problem that already exists because of the CNC tools that have made it into Russia? And how much of this is a question of saying that no more machine tools making it will make a meaningful difference over 3, 6, 12 months, or longer term horizons?
Well, I actually I want to answer this. I also want to get back to Charles's question about spare parts suppliers. In answer to your question, Max, how much of it is a question of degrading? So you're saying degrading current production or degrading subsequent expansion of production? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I'm saying basically, do the Russians have enough of these machine tools, and how many more? Obviously there was that big flood that we talked about of imports you identified coming from that October. Is there still Russian demand for a whole bunch more like that, or you just try to do it anyway because it's useful to have extras in stock? Or how much is it to say what we really need to focus on is degrading those that Russia's already sort of snuck over the line?
I think at this point, they had the amount of machine tools they have on factory floors now is the exact amount they need to produce the amounts of military hardware that they're producing now. The questions of them expanding production, they're going to have a tough time to ramp up expanded production if we're using CNC machine tools specifically as a metric. They're going to have a hard time ramping up production immediately, because these are ultimately human operated with a computer interface, and it's going to take time to train people up on how to use these machines. There's a real dearth of specialized personnel in Russia who know how to operate CNC machine tools. You see help or employment ads for these technologies all over the place. I think at this point the focus should be on denying access to those consumables. Not just because they're going to degrade the existence of the operation of existing machine tools, but precisely because they can import as many of these devices as they want, the actual machine tools, but if they don't have the consumables to sustain their operation and productive capabilities over time, then it becomes a moot point about how many you're able to stockpile. And I do think, for what it's worth, that some of the import activity we're seeing, imports of CNC machine tools, is reflective of an effort to stockpile these technologies. But that's my sense, is you really want to go after the productive capacities that are already there. And with regards to Charles's question about investors in spare parts trading companies, this is actually getting at a really, really, really important point for policymakers to look at when they're looking at CNC machine tools in particular. It's not enough to just go after the new equipment. There's also a huge market in used machine tools out there that is really like under the radar of regulators. It's the kind of environment where you ship the most advanced machine tool there is out there, let's say hypothetically, to an end user in Thailand that's totally legit, but they're better at running and operating machine tools than they are at running a business. That business goes under, business in Thailand goes under. They put up those tools for auction to create liquidity for bankruptcy. And what happens to those machine tools then when they're sold off at auction? Who can say? Are the people buying those tools legit? Are they bad actors? Are they even aware of the need to report? In the case of U.S. manufactured machine tools, are they aware of the need to notify BIS of their acquisition of these tools and get necessary licenses? It's a whole there's a whole ecosystem of websites out there, for example, that deal in used machine tools and spare parts. And to the extent that those websites are publicly traded, or there's a way for their shareholders to become aware of the issues with that business, potential issues with that business, it's something that needs to be explored. It's sort of out of my bailiwick, but it's something I'm aware of and I think about a great deal. So that's a great question. All great questions.
And I think that's really relevant, considering that Russia still relies on sort of older weapon systems and older, like on renovating the Soviet era machines that they have, rather than bringing in brand new ones, right? So that used machine tools are probably way more useful and important to for Russian manufacturing at the moment, as far as if it affects its ability to keep on fighting in Ukraine in the short term.
Good enough is like rule of the day. Is it good enough to sustain the production that they're already to sustain the military industrial production levels that they're already at? Is it good enough? Great. It doesn't need to be the fanciest thing in the world.
Right. This has been a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you both, Max and Alan. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I'm very happy that I can invite our audience to our website, fpra.org, because we have a really interesting and fascinating report coming out next week on this very subject. And it's quite detailed. I've really enjoyed reading it ahead of time. That's the benefit of working at FPRI. I want to also thank Taiwa Hong, who could not be here today, but Taiwa did a significant amount of work on this report, along with Max. Thank you, Max, and thank you, Alan, and thank you to our audience for joining us today and for supporting FPRI. And I hope you will continue to subscribe to our newsletters, our updates, keep visiting our website, and keep supporting FPRI. Thank you very much. And as a reminder, this discussion will be available as a recording on our YouTube page shortly today.